Welcome to The Good Ride. I'm James Beastie, and I'm deeply committed to an open relationship with snowboard gear. Next to me is the Stone Origin, and next to that is the Natural, two of their more directional boards in Stone's line that I'm reviewing for you today. I'll be primarily talking about the Origin, but I will reference the Natural here and there because if you're looking at that, you might be looking at this. I rode this primarily with Union Atlas, Ride Fuse, and Footprint, King Foam, Orthotic Elite insoles. I got this in some decent powder, some pretty good groomers, and some other snow as well. To give you a short summary, it's got some early rise before the nose, a mellow flat to early rise. It's got camber down to the tail. It's more for upper intermediates, advanced and expert riders. And I felt like it floated a little better, was a little more forgiving, and just a little more accessible for average riders than the Natural that you see next to it here that has full camber, has less setback on board in powder, is a little stiffer flex, and is just a little more unforgiving. I'm not a super fan of all the structure that's put into Stone's bases. I wish there was less, but all in all, this is a good one-board quiver for those who lean a little bit on the directional side of all mountain. So when it comes to sizing, for being size 9, 185 pounds and 5'10", this was the right fit of all the boards. I wouldn't want to go bigger, and I definitely wouldn't want to go smaller. The one thing is this felt great for my weight at 185, great for my height at 5'10", but not as ideal as I'd like with the size 9. It was definitely manageable. I had on some pretty responsive boots and bindings, but yet it still felt a touch off for me control-wise. And I think this is better for like a size 10 and up, depending on, the size you choose. Same with the Natural. The 59 felt right for me across the board. Maybe a touch wide for my size 9 boots, but overall pretty manageable. Wouldn't want to change the sizing on that either. Now, when it comes to shape, this is tapered and directional, but it's only 2 mil of taper. So essentially, it's just a directional board. You don't feel that taper on snow. Same with the Natural. That only has 5 mil of taper, so you don't really feel that either on snow. Maybe a touch more than the Origin, but both feel more on the all mountain side. They have a much more centered feeling ride. The Origin has camber basically from the tail to a little bit past the front inserts. Then it goes into a mellow, almost flat to early rise. So it's a very mellow transition into rocker before the nose. And it makes the board a little bit more forgiving than the Natural, which is full-on unforgiving camber. But the flat transition can make it feel a little catchy. The wider width for me was a little harder to skid my turns in certain situations. It felt a little more locked in, a little more technical than I thought it would for looking at the camber profile. So overall, I'd say it's more advanced to expert riders, but a strong intermediate could handle this if they're okay with consequences that can result from getting off your game and skidding your turn. You could catch an edge on occasion. Now let's talk flex here. There is a medium stiff flex going on. Definitely a little softer in the tail. As you could see, most of the give in this flex was coming at the tail. And the nose is just a touch softer than the tail. And then it's pretty stiff between the feet, but not terribly stiff. Overall, it's like just on the medium stiff side of medium, and there's good energy. This has a dynamic flex. I like it. In comparison to the Natural, there's definitely a stiffer flex, and this like wood or faux wood top sheet here seems to dampen it up a little bit, but also make it a little bit more work to access and engage that pop. Now, for an average rider like myself, the Origin was much better to butter with. It still took a good bit of work off the tail, primarily because there's camber there, but when I wanted to butter off the nose, it was doable for sure and a lot easier. Now, the Natural just felt like a lot more work from tip to tail. It's just full camber. It's not really letting you butter that easy. You have to be a very strong technical butterer to make this work for you. Same with the pop. It took a lot more work for me to access this pop. Where the Stone Origin, while it doesn't have full camber, it was easier for me to access the camber that was there and get it to pop. So for me, it popped about the same, but if you're a stronger rider, you're gonna get a lot more out of the natural. So you take this flex personality and you apply it to all kinds of conditions that you'll experience on the mountain. I thought this did pretty well. It wasn't the best of the best, but it's far from being the worst. I wouldn't have any issues with this handling hard, micro bumpy snow, nor did I have issues when I was in uneven terrain. If you want to power through Chunder more, the natural is going to be the better call there. It's a little more damp. It's a little more shock absorbent with that extra camber, but it's a little more aggressive, a little more technical. So it all comes down to personal preference, but both boards do really good for all day riding. When it comes to speed, this is very competent, and the side cut seems to like a straight line pretty well without getting too chattery and sending too much feedback. It's no super bomber, but it's pretty good. The natural's a little bit better for straight lining, but both are pretty good. When it comes to the base glide, I'm not that into all that structure, but I waxed over it and it did a little bit better, but you can still hear the record vinyl. It seems like they have mellowed out the structure, or I just got some bad demos that had too much structure the year before it was made. Whatever it was, it's not as bad anymore, and I don't think most people will want a base grind to get it to ride well. This is good out of the wrapper. When it comes to edge hold, I felt the Origin was pretty competent. So is the Natural. They both gripped pretty well. They're very comfortable in hard snow. They might not be hard snow specialists, but they're very good. When it comes to turn initiation, it went wherever I needed it to go okay. There were only a few times in the trees where I wanted to turn and I just didn't feel like it was getting there as fast as I'd like it to, but I never felt out of control and like I'm tracking towards something I want to avoid. When I got this edge committed throughout a turn on groomers, it was just a little more on the straight line side and not as balanced for across the groomer to circle carving, but it's doable, but just not ideal. I think it felt just a touch more on the straight liney side of balanced. The Natural, for some reason, they both have 8-meter side cuts. This just felt a little more turny, a little more across the groomer. It's 2 centimeters longer and the 8-meter side cut works a little bit deeper with that 159, but it could just be that there are a lot more details to the shaping and construction of a board than what you see on the specs and what I see on the specs on their site. Whatever it is, the Natural can straight line really well, but it just felt a little bit more turny. In terms of spring out of the turn and just pure carving pop, of course you want the Natural over the Origin. But the Origin was no slouch and it felt pretty good. I felt like I could rail a turn pretty hard and I had satisfying spring out of it. I could front foot weight, center weight, and I could back foot weight the end of the carve and really get a spring out of the turn. None of these boards ever felt washy and they drove pretty hard. Obviously the Natural with all that camber took more work to access it, but I could get more spring out of that, and it's a very satisfying but very technical turn. So when it comes to powder, the Origin did a pretty good job, but not an amazing job. It was definitely better than the Natural by a good bit. But I did ride some all mountain boards with a little easier directional float, but still it's very doable. So if you set the Origin all the way back at a 21.25 inch stance width, you can get 2.25 inches back from center of board. That's on this 157 here. With the Natural, you can only get 1.75 inches back from center of board with a 21.5 inch stance width. Now, I love the stance width when you set it all the way back with both these boards. I think it matches most people's normal stance width, so that's great. But in riding powder, the Origin was much better for me. It had easier directional float. The Natural felt very old school, very camber, pretty centered for 5 mil of taper. So it's for big mountain riding. It's for people who really understand how to ride camber and powder. It's not for average riders like myself who primarily ride low angle powder these days. The Origin would do better in steeper terrain as well, but it was better in low angle powder for me, and it's not bad for an all mountain board. When it comes to switch riding, both of these are doable, but far from ideal. There are better boards out there. If you want to ride switch all the time, look at the Message or other True Twins. But for a tapered directional board, well, 2 mil of taper, but it's still technically a tapered directional board, I could throw this around and ride switch pretty well, even though the camber profile is very directional and there's early rise before the nose. It worked okay. It was definitely doable. I actually preferred the Natural a little bit more than the Origin, even though it has more taper, 3 mil more of taper, but it's pretty doable and pretty fun. These can both hit kickers pretty well. I actually prefer the Natural in pipe just because of that more turny feel. I don't like boards that feel wide for me in the pipe, and this feels a little wide for me, but you know, it could work for you as well. And this thing really tracks well into a kicker. I love the feel of that. Whatever they're doing side cut wise really works for those who like to hit kickers. So overall, I think it's a very good one board quiver, especially for average riders like myself. I would recommend this to most over the Natural. The Natural's more of a specific board for technical, advanced to expert riders. This is more for the rest of us, this Origin. So could work if you're looking for a one board quiver for a little bit of everything.